You're listening to the I'm Busy Being Awesome podcast with Paula Engebretson, episode number 208. Hey there, welcome back to the podcast, episode 208, which is part 2 of our deep dive into navigating overwhelm. So, as I mentioned in last week's episode, episode 207, overwhelm is a very familiar experience for those of us with ADHD and ADHD tendencies. I mean, we know it all too well. And for some of us, it's a daily occurrence, which, let's be honest, can be both physically and mentally exhausting in and of itself. Now, I think about the experience of overwhelm, of feeling overwhelmed, as a really important signal that we get from our brain and our body. So when I'm feeling overwhelmed, I'm thinking to myself, okay, this means I have clearly reached my capacity. I cannot take any more action. My prefrontal cortex has gone offline. It has left the building. I need some kind of break. If I was a glass, a drinking glass, you could not pour anything else into it because it's full. I'm at capacity. And this signal of overwhelm from the brain and the body, it reminds us that it is time to take a step back, to take care of ourselves. It's a really important reminder for us to pause, to regulate, and to self-soothe. Now, this experience of overwhelm can really kind of throw us off our groove. Side note, the moment I said that phrase, I started thinking about the opening scene from Emperor's New Groove, when Emperor Kuzco is dancing and then gets interrupted and he's all, "Hey, you threw off my groove." That's where my brain just went. Welcome back, Paula. Okay. But seriously, when we experience that big wash of overwhelm, it can really derail us. It can leave us feeling frozen or stuck, or maybe we end up distracting ourselves from the work that we actually want to do. And because of this, that's why I decided to carve out space both in last week's episode and this week's episode to provide you with specific examples and tools to help you navigate overwhelm and move through that emotion whenever it arises. I like to think of the tools that we're talking about in last week's and this week's episode as tools to keep in your ADHD toolkit, so you can pull them out whenever you're feeling overwhelmed and you can help ground yourself and find some clarity, and then take that next step forward in the direction that you want to go. Now, last week, I gave an overview of 2 different situations in which we tend to feel overwhelmed the most often. The first is when we get really swamped by all the tiny details. This is when we get lost in the weeds and we convince ourselves that there's a right choice or a best decision to make, and we worry about all of those tiny details. And in these situations, we often lose sight of the big picture. This is where that phrase, "you can't see the forest for the trees," really comes into play, because we're so focused on each of the specific trees that we forget there's an entire forest when we pull back just a little bit. And that's exactly how we talked about navigating overwhelm, this particular flavor of overwhelm, last week. We want to pull back from the details. We want to get out of the weeds and remind ourselves of that big picture and what matters most. When we find ourselves spinning in this uncertainty, when we're lost in the minutia about what font to choose, or we're lost in analysis paralysis about whether we should choose option A, B, C, D, E, or F when it comes to planning our 3-day business trip, we want to pull back and ask ourselves, okay, but what actually matters here? What is most important, and what does done look like? When you step back in this way, you help your brain remember that there is a forest. You help your brain step back from the details of each individual tree. You see the forest as a whole, which allows you to create greater clarity and prioritize what's essential and start taking action one step at a time. Now, if you haven't listened to this episode yet, episode 207, I do highly encourage you to scroll back, give it a listen after you finish this one. You don't have to listen to the episodes in order, but they do complement each other well. So I encourage you to make time for episode 207 as well, especially because I do give a lot of specific examples to really put these steps that I just kind of glossed over into context. So again, In episode 207, just last week, we looked at how to see the forest for the trees, how to pull ourselves out of the weeds, how to take action without feeling so swamped by all of those tiny details. Well, this week, we are taking the opposite approach because the other situation in which many of us ADHD brains often feel overwhelmed is when we're essentially frozen in the big picture. So often we have these big, brilliant ideas. I mean, we are idea machines, right? And while these ideas completely light us up and we can't wait to get started, we also usually can't figure out how to get started. We know we want to start, but we can't seem to do it. And this is because our brain has a really hard time with the process of sequencing. We have a hard time with breaking down that overarching picture into smaller, more bite-sized steps and doing so in an order that makes sense. So instead of doing that, we write on our to-do list on Tuesday at 10 a.m. something like start business, declutter house, or in the case of one of the examples that we'll look at today, plan for the next school year. These tasks are way too big for 10 o'clock on Tuesday. We don't actually know what they mean. And the brain has absolutely no clue where to even think about beginning, so we don't. Instead, we spin in confusion. We might procrastinate around the work. We might do similar busy work. Most likely, we also beat ourselves up for not doing the thing, even though we put it on our schedule. We think, what's my problem? It was on my schedule. I didn't get anything done. Why can't I just get started? It's not that hard. I know what I need to do. But the truth is this, your brain doesn't actually know what to do. It has a general idea of the direction in which you're headed, but it has no idea how to get there because that project or task is way too big. An analogy that you maybe have heard me use before on the podcast, but I just love it. I think it's really effective, is using a map or trying to get to a certain place. Okay. So this situation is kind of similar to someone writing on my to-do list for tomorrow, drive to Seward. And that's it. Now, I have no idea where that is. I don't even know what state it is. I don't know the direction in which I'm heading. All it says on my schedule is drive to Seward. Now, I do technically know what I need to do. I do know that I need to drive to Seward, but I literally know nothing else. And because of this, I would spin. I wouldn't be able to get started. So what we need to do is break it down, because otherwise I'm just going to sit right here in the same place, not doing anything. So what do? Well, if I know I need to drive to Seward, maybe I do a little bit of research first and I figure out where that is. And I go, oh, it turns out Seward's in Alaska. Good to know. Now I know I'm driving north. It's going to take more than a couple hours. Then maybe I do some more research and I figure out where in Seward I'm going specifically. Maybe I get an address so I can figure out the actual turn-by-turn instructions with a better idea of when I'm going to get there and how long my driving days are going to be each day. And with that additional information, I can then start making more specific plans. But until I start breaking down the steps and gaining additional information about what I actually need to do one step at a time, there is no way in the world I would get to Seward. Well, the thing is, it's the same thing when you think about that big presentation your boss wants you to complete for Thursday. Or that brilliant redecorating project that you saw on Pinterest and you bought all the supplies for, but you don't know where to start. We've all been there. And the secret to getting yourself into motion is zooming in. We need to get smaller. We need to get specific. So, what does this look like? How do we do that? Well, let's talk about some specific examples of how we can go from this big picture of not knowing what we're doing and zooming in to get specific details, to get those turn-by-turn instructions. So in my 3-day training from last month, Overwhelmed to Action, one of the topics that we explored on the live coaching call focused on preparing for the upcoming school year. We had several different professors on the call, and I not only saw people sharing these questions in the chat, asking about how on earth you can get ready for the next semester or the next school year, but also one of the people who raised their hand for live coaching wanted help on this specific topic in terms of moving through the overwhelm when she was thinking about the planning process so she could actually dive in and get started this summer so she's ready for the school year ahead. And of course, I also remember this feeling of overwhelm so strongly when it comes to getting ready for classes each semester. Even though I left academia in July of 2021, still every August and December, I'll feel this minor blip of panic, this rush from my brain thinking, oh my gosh, did I get my syllabi ready? Is the website up? Is everything uploaded properly? Still, even now. And so this topic in particular, preparing for something that's going to unfold over a longer period of time, whether it's a syllabus or whether it's planning the different activities for your family throughout the fall or something, okay, whatever it is, this can feel especially challenging for an ADHD brain because it's not only taking that big picture project and breaking it up into smaller pieces, but you're also now asking your brain to take into account planning and structuring the projects and the readings and knowing how much that you can complete within a certain amount of time. It's asking you to take into account prioritization and needing to decide what readings to include and what topics to explore and which ones you have to leave out because you only have 16 weeks to get stuff done. I remember thinking when I designed both my history of rock class and my history of protest music, thinking, how can I possibly choose just 16 weeks worth of artists? There's just no way. There's so much music I have to explore. How can I possibly prioritize? There's so much to look at. There's so much important information. And the same is true whether you're planning a class or you're mapping out your family's fall schedule, or maybe you're a small business owner and you're planning out the next quarter and the different product launches for the following season. This type of situation can feel extremely challenging for the ADHD brain. And it's a situation where zooming in and getting really specific is especially effective. So let's talk about how to do this. First of all, we need to make sure that we know where we're going. Okay, so just as I mentioned, if we don't know that Seward's in Alaska, that's not super helpful, okay? For whatever project or plan that you're creating, we need to know where you're going. So just as we talked about with the strategy of zooming out, when we zoom in, we also want to know what done looks like. Where are you going? What is the end product you're creating? If we think about planning out the upcoming school year as the example, we might start by saying, okay, I have all my classes planned out for both the fall and the spring semester. And that looks like each class having a syllabus where I've identified all the projects, all the assignments, all the weekly readings. And I also know what I'm teaching for each week during lecture. Great. Okay, that's what done looks like for that particular example. So for you, you want to first identify what done looks like. From there, we can then zoom in a little bit. Think of it like you're looking at Google Maps and you've just entered the address where you are now and you've put in where you want to go, what done looks like in this situation, preparing for the school year ahead. And now we're essentially kind of looking at the big picture of one squiggly red line from one point to another. We kind of see the big picture of how we're going to get there generally. Now what we want to do is zoom in one click. It's like when you press the little plus button on the map and it allows you to zoom in one click a little bit closer and you see a little bit more detail in the step-by-step instructions. That's what we want to do now. So now with planning for the entire school year, maybe we zoom in one click and we go, okay, rather than that, let's plan for just the fall semester first. So we've zoomed in one click. We know we're looking at fall semester. Then we go, okay, well, let's actually zoom in one click more, learn a little more detail, and remind ourselves, how many classes are we teaching? What classes are brand new? Which ones have I taught before? Right? So for the sake of this example, maybe you're teaching 3 classes and one of them is new. 2 of them you've done before. Great. So now we have a little more detail to work with. We're going to press that plus button. We're going to zoom in one click further. We go, okay, As I zoom in, now I'm maybe zooming in on the new class because I've never taught that before. And I want to have a little bit more time to think it through. Okay. So I know I can zoom back out. I know I can look at class 2 and class 3 next. But for now, I want to zoom in on this first leg of the trip, that first class, and get more specific turn-by-turn instructions there. That's where I want to get more detail for the new class fall semester. Or if it's a different example, maybe the first project or the first product launch for Q3 in your business, whatever. Okay. Because as I just was alluding to, I do realize I'm talking about planning a semester and not everybody's a teacher, but remind your brain that the exercise I'm using here can apply to any type of big picture project you're working on. If you own a clothing boutique and you're mapping out your new products for the upcoming quarter, you might zoom in on one type of clothing or brand at a time, or maybe it's by season and you zoom in on the late summer season styles and then the back to school clothes and then that early fall when everybody really wants to be in cute sweaters and boots, but it's still way too hot. So it's just summer clothes, but in fall colors, right? We kind of work according to the season. So even though we're using this planning for a semester, it can be applied to anything. So really challenge your brain to practice that cognitive flexibility and see what type of big project you might feel overwhelmed thinking about and see how we can kind of zoom in one click at a time to create more detail for you. Okay? Anywhere that your brain is thinking, I don't know where to start, you can follow the same process. Okay. So if we think back to our first example with a new semester, we've zoomed in on the classes, we've identified the new class, and we're going to press that little plus button once more and zoom in further to that new class and learn even more information because each time that we zoom in, we get even more specific in our steps. Now, you'll note that we haven't taken action in any of these areas yet. All we're doing is zooming in again and again and again to gather more information, to create greater clarity of where we're at and what needs to be done first. And in fact, we're going to keep zooming in until we get to a point where it's clear that we've reached an action point, where we can't move forward anymore until we take that step. So when we look at the plan for planning your school year on our schedule, of course, there's no clear action step, right? Plan your school year. What? I don't even know what that means. So we keep zooming in until we get to the level of specificity that the brain knows exactly what to do. So we keep zooming in. We've zoomed in on the one class. And now maybe we ask ourselves a question like, okay, well, what are the specific learning objectives? What do you want to ensure your students walk away knowing by the end of this semester? In other words, what matters most? What's most important about the content in this class? Now, this here is an action step because what we need to do is make a decision. We need to decide what our learning objectives are before we can move on to the next step of choosing the different materials that are going to help teach those different objectives. Okay, so that is step one. We want to keep zooming in until we reach a point where we can't move forward anymore until we take action. In this example of planning the semester, our first action was deciding those specific learning objectives for the class. If we go back to the clothing store example, maybe you decide the specific brands you want to work with that season. So now let's assume you've taken that first action step when you're planning your semester and you've identified the top 5 to 6 learning objectives for your new class. Now what? Well, if we're not sure what to do, that means we probably want to zoom in again. We want to do another click further. We need to get more specific. If you've identified your learning objectives, maybe what we need to do is zoom in and ask ourselves, okay, so these are the learning objectives. How am I going to measure that? How will I know whether the students have successfully learned this material or not? That's our next action step. Again, it's around decision making. We need to decide. So maybe you decide you're going to have a combination of different learning assessments. You're going to have a couple of papers and you'll have a couple tests and maybe you have a presentation. Awesome. You finish that action step. Now we're going to zoom in one step further. When are the different assessments due? We want to assign those dates. That's the next action step. Choose dates to assign the assessments. And from here, You might find that you zoom in even further and you focus only on one specific assessment. So now we keep zooming in and we go, okay, well, here's the first assessment. And I know that it's due this date in September. So what's the information that the students need to learn between the start of the school year and the first assessment to ensure that they know what to do? And then we make decisions identifying that information about what you're going to teach versus what they're going to read about outside of class. And once you've made that decision on that information for the first assessment, you then might zoom in to assessment number 2 and go, okay, how about here? How about the information between assessment 1 and assessment 2? What's the information they need to learn here? And we answer those same questions. So again, whatever big project it is that you're breaking down, as you can hear, it's a very methodical approach. We're going from big picture and we keep zooming in one click at a time until you get to an action step. Once you reach that action point where you can't move forward until you take the action, that's your step. Take that step. And then zoom in one click further. What comes next? And whenever you get stuck, if you ever notice your brain spinning or you start slipping into overwhelm and you're thinking, I have no idea where to start or what to do next or what I should do, challenge your brain. Think to yourself, okay, probably I just need to zoom in one click. How can I get more specific here? Because chances are we're too big. We're too vague. So how do we make it smaller? How do we make it more specific? If the brain doesn't have direction, if it doesn't know where to start, we probably need to get smaller. We probably need to zoom in. Also, I want to remind you to go slow. Give yourself space to take this step by step. This is an exercise that is incredibly demanding on the ADHD brain. It is challenging. Now, with practice, it does become more familiar, but it's easy for the brain to slip into overwhelm with big projects like this, especially if this step-by-step process isn't super familiar or if it's not well practiced yet. Now, I also want to mention that in situations like this, it can feel really challenging to simply get ourselves to slow down in the first place and map out that step-by-step. Your brain, if it's like mine, is going to say things like, this is going to take way too long. I don't have time to do that kind of step-by-step process. I don't have time to slow down. And if your brain ever offers thoughts like this as well, I'd invite you to ask yourself, with all the love in the world and maybe a little bit of playfulness, okay, but how's that been working out for you? Whenever I notice my brain thinking some version of that thought, I just don't have time for this, I lovingly ask myself, how's that thought working out, Paula? Is it getting you moving forward? Is it working at all? Because spoiler alert, it never is helpful. It never works. So then I go, okay, but what if we give breaking things down a try? It seems that always works. So what if it's possible it will work again? What if we slow down and give it a try? Because honestly, whenever I notice my brain resisting breaking down the steps, whenever I think to myself, I don't have time for XYZ, I just need to get started, it's essentially a bright neon flashing sign pointing to the fact that I need to slow down and make time for whatever the thing is. It's exactly what I need to do to move forward more effectively. Now, I'll also mention that this process of breaking down tasks, it's a skill. It's one that takes practice, and it's one that is actually great to do with a coach or your partner or a colleague or a friend. Having somebody sit with you who is encouraging and supportive and allows you to kind of pause and verbally process through the steps and work through it together as you're breaking those things down, that can be really supportive for an ADHD brain. It's one of my favorite ways to really work through big projects myself. So don't be afraid to put in some extra scaffolding if your brain needs that, right? If that feels supportive for you. It's a really powerful approach for me, and I encourage you to give it a try too. All right, let's talk about one more example to put this exercise of zooming in into practice. So in the chat from day 2 of the training last month, somebody shared that they often find themselves spinning, stuck in the big picture when it comes to planning and long to-do lists. They said that they can't seem to take action on their priorities, and instead they just feel really stuck. And I know for a fact that this is such a relatable obstacle for nearly every single ADHD brain in some area of our lives, right? That struggle is real. And I want to address this from two different angles today. The first is if you already know the priority, you have a long list of things, but you already know the priority and you just can't seem to get your brain to take action on it. Okay, so that's the first category. The second lens that we're going to look through is when everything seems like a fire, everything seems important, and you don't know where to start. You don't know what to pick first. How do we handle that? Okay, so those are the two lenses that we're going to look through. So let's talk about the first situation that I mentioned where you do know the priority. Okay, so let's start there first. For example, maybe you have a long to-do list of, a bunch of different tasks, but you know without a doubt that completing the charts for work by the end of the day is number one on the list. It's due, people are waiting on it. There's no question in your mind. That's the most important thing. But for whatever reason, you find yourself checking email and helping other people on their projects and doing other administrative stuff that you would normally avoid at all costs. And essentially, you've noticed that procrastinating has completely taken over and you can't seem to get started on that one thing you know is most important. What do we do? Well, the good news is that this is the exact same process that we just talked about when we looked at planning out the school year. Because what's likely happening here is that your brain is too overwhelmed thinking about the big project, in this situation, doing all the charting by the end of the day. We know what done looks like. We know the charts are done. They're submitted wherever you need to submit them. So now, how do we zoom in? How do we make that example, that situation, smaller? So maybe you zoom in according to timeline. And so you work first on Monday and Tuesday of last week, then Wednesday and Thursday, and then Friday of last week and Monday of this week, right? So you break it down in that way. And then you zoom in one click further to create even greater clarity about the task and what needs to be done about Monday and Tuesday's charts. And you keep zooming in until you find the first action step. Right? So you keep zooming in, keep making it smaller. Essentially, it's the same approach that we explored with planning for the school year. Okay. If you know the priority on your long to-do list, but you're just not taking action on it, chances are the project is too big and you haven't broken it down far enough. So the brain just doesn't know where to start. It feels really overwhelmed. It's spinning out. Now, there could be other reasons why you're stuck as well, but it's a pretty safe bet that if this is work you genuinely want to do, you do want to get it done, a key way to help you create some traction and take action is to, oh, that's a nice rhyme, create some traction and create action is to zoom in and give your brain more specific instruction. Okay? What about the other situation? What about when you don't know what's most important? You have 47 things on your to-do list and everything legitimately seems equally important. Or maybe you can go, okay, well, these 4 things can probably wait, but the remaining 43 all have to happen now. What do we do? So this is an area that I explore in depth with my clients, both one-on-one and in We're Busy Being Awesome. In fact, I have 3 key ways to help your brain quickly clarify your priorities and where to put your attention first based on what's on your to-do list and what feels most supportive for your brain and what works best for your working style. Now, this episode's already getting quite long. I don't have time to go into all of that today, but I do want to offer some powerful clarifying questions to help you quickly identify what goes at the top of the list. So, again, if we're stuck in the big picture of a massive to-do list and all the things that you want to get done, what we want to do is zoom in one click for additional clarity. And to do this, I first encourage you to look at your list and ask yourself, okay, of all the things here, what tasks actually have deadlines? Deadlines either set by myself or somebody else. These items belong at the top of the list. Now, you might be rolling your eyes. You might be like, duh, of course the things with the timeline need to be at the top. But honestly, pause for a minute. How often do you actually slow down to separate the things that have a genuine due date clearly in your mind? I know for myself, if I'm not intentional, I don't think about it. The answer for me is essentially never, unless I really create that distinction. So do that for yourself. Make it really clear what has a due date and what doesn't. Now, as you go through that list and you identify these deadlines, if you find that some items don't have a deadline, you have two options. You can either A, give it a deadline, right, and include it in the ranking of the things that have deadlines, or B, you can intentionally decide that that task or that project, it can wait. If there's no deadline, whether decided by you or somebody else, it's probably not critical. So we've identified priority in terms of deadline. Now we're going to zoom in one click further. Okay, so looking at your list, you can ask yourself now, which of these items on my list require my attention this week? What needs to get done this week? And really pause with this question. If your brain is like mine, you will absolutely want to say you have to do all of it. And in fact, you can probably get it all done and add a few more things because we're super time blind. And that might be true. You might be able to get even more done. But I challenge you to really pause with each task that's left on your list that has a due date and identify what items need to happen this week, no matter what. Then once you have that list identified, we zoom in one click more and you ask yourself, okay, from this list of items that must happen this week, what requires immediate attention today? From this list of weekly tasks, what must I take action on today? Again, your brain will likely want to say that everything should happen today. This is very common, totally normal response for an ADHD brain that loves all or nothing thinking. But again, we know that's not likely the case. And in fact, it's very unlikely that everything on your list requires immediate attention today. As a side note, if that is true, if you do have dozens of things that must happen today, your next action step might be learning more about delegation and asking for help. And for that, I'd highly recommend checking out episode 108 of the podcast. I will link to it in the show notes. But again, chances are there are only a handful of things on your weekly list that absolutely must happen today. So identify those. Then from there, we zoom in one click further and you ask yourself, okay, with this first task on my list, 1, what does done look like? 2, what are the steps involved to get from where I am to done? And 3, what is the first smallest step that I can take to get started on this task? And you're going to ask yourself those 3 questions for the items left over that you need to take action on today. So ask yourself those same 3 questions for the remaining 2 or 3 other non-negotiables on your list. And just like that, you've gone from a list of 47 things that all seemed like a fire to a clear action plan for today with where to focus your attention, where to start, and the specific steps to take. And if you ever find that you start spinning in overwhelm, asking yourself, oh, I don't know what to do, I'm so overwhelmed, check in and go, okay, well, do I need to zoom in one step further? Do I need to get just a little more specific? And alternatively, maybe you start getting lost in the weeds after you've zoomed in so much and you're looking at all of the different details. Remember, you can always pull back out as well. If you're stuck in the weeds looking at all the steps for the day, you can zoom out and go, okay, hold on. Remember, I only have 3 non-negotiables today. That's it. I'm focused on these 3 things. And I'm going to zoom in on this one until I find the first action step. And I'm going to take that step. So these zoom in and zoom out strategies in your toolkit, they pair really well together. And you may find that you use both at different times as you work on bigger projects and tasks. And that is beautiful. That's why you have both. They're intended to work with one another. And with practice, you're going to start knowing immediately which tool to grab in any given situation so that you're navigating that overwhelm with much greater ease. All right, my friends, that's going to do it for us this week. And if you're ready to take these concepts deeper and apply them to your life, if you're ready to learn how to support your ADHD in a way that works for you, then I invite you to check out today's show notes or head to I'mBusyBeingAwesome.com/group to learn more about my small group coaching program, We're Busy Being Awesome. If it sounds like a great fit for you, you can add your name to the waitlist and be the first to know when the next cohort begins. Also, have you grabbed my free ebook? It's called 10 Tips to Work with Your ADHD Brain, and it's filled with actionable strategies to help you reduce your overwhelm, reclaim your time, and get things done. You can grab your copy through the link in the show notes and put them to use today. Until next time, keep being awesome. I'll talk with you soon.